The Director of Policy and Research at the DC Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security. I currently work at the United States Institute of Peace in the Office of Administration. And I will stop here and kick it back at Bejan to get us started with what's next.
Okay, thank you, Asmik. So again, this workshop is brought to you by the DC Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security. So this is a part of our day-long launch event for International Women's Day. Asmik and I both serve on the planning committee for this event, and we'll be doing more events in the future. We'll be writing policy papers based off of what was said here today and in the other workshops. So we just wanted to thank our panelists for joining us here today and giving us these ideas to kind of run with after the session. We are also aware that we are welcoming people from all across the world. We have over 100 people registered for this event, for this workshop in particular, and over 300 people registered for the event in total, spanning from here to Africa to Europe. So we're so excited to welcome you all here with us today. I'm going to pass the floor over to our panelists again for their introductions, and then we'll get started with the conversation. I'm going to start with Gayatri Patel, and then we'll move over to Jamille Bigio, and then Belquis Ahmadi. So Gayatri, I'm going to pass the floor over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Bejan. My name is Gayatri Patel. I'm the Director for Gender Advocacy at CARE USA, which is an international NGO working on humanitarian assistance and development. But my work is really focused on influencing US government policy on gender equality issues. So in that space, I sit on the Coalition for Feminist Foreign Policy in the US as part of the steering group. And I share that work with Jamille, who I think is going to be going next. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Wonderful to be with you all. My name is Jamille Bigio. I'm a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in our Women in Foreign Policy program. There I've been leading our work on women, peace, and security, and we've also been doing work on understanding gender equality in foreign policy and kind of within the broader framework of feminist foreign policy, women's economic leadership, women's political leadership, so looking across the whole spectrum. I come to this work having worked for 5 years in the US government on the White House National Security Council staff and at state and DoD. And before that with the UN, and I even consulted for CARE in Ethiopia way back when, so it's so fun to get to continue to see all CARE's amazing work under Gayatri's leadership in the gender space. Great to be with you all.
Thanks, Jamille. We also used to work together at State, if you remember,
Of course,
when I was there for a while, so good to be here with you.
So I think Belquis, over to you if you could introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm having trouble with seeing the Zoom link, so I can't see anything. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's such an honor to be here among such a distinguished group of women's rights advocates and leaders, and especially the future leaders who will be carrying out the torch to the next generation. I work as Senior Program Officer with USIP. My background is in human rights law, and I am an Afghan American, have been working on issues related to gender, women's rights, and rule of law and women's participation in peace process. Thank you.
Thank you all for those introductions. I realized I meant to give you all some housekeeping. So just to let you all know, we have some wonderful Zoom experts doing magic in the background for anyone who needs help. So we have Adriana and Lady helping us, and we thank you so much for doing that. We wouldn't be here without you all. So if anyone is having trouble kind of hearing things or trouble with the video, please reach out to Lady and Adriana. Also, they will be keeping time for us. So they'll be giving us some time cues to keep on with the conversation. I think that they will open up the Q&A function or chat function to chat in anything, and also for them to share some resources that the presenters have shared with us. So I think that is all for our housekeeping, if I'm not forgetting anything, Asmik. And I will push the floor over to you to begin our discussion.
Thank you, Bejan. Let's start with a very general, very broad question about feminist foreign policy. I'd like to begin by asking all of you, all three of you, and this is based on your opinion and on your experience, what do you think are the main building blocks of establishing and implementing feminist foreign policy? And we can start with Jamila, go to Belquis, and conclude with Gayatri.
Great. Yes, so I'd say kind of as we look at feminist foreign policy, if I could also just take a step back for everybody, that this is a term that was first used by the Swedish government. There's certainly been advocacy around it before then, but in the actual kind of work of governments, it was first used by the Swedish government in 2014 when they adopted an explicitly feminist foreign policy. And we've now seen, since then, we've seen additional governments embrace that terminology, from Canada to France to Mexico, others that have kind of pledged to do it, like from Malaysia to Spain, and really seeing kind of a broad range of countries embrace this idea. And there's a couple of, it is a concept where governments are using slightly different definitions, but there is a definition that is kind of building support consensus around, which Gayatri can talk about in terms of the advocacy work that the US coalition is doing around building consensus around a definition. But I think, some of the core pieces to note are kind of the importance of looking at the opportunities and rights of women and girls as it relates to the entire foreign policy agenda, from defense to diplomacy, development, and trade. Also looking at kind of broader gender analysis within that. So the importance of really looking at kind of not just the need to advance, kind of the need to advance gender equity, and within that, an intersectional lens of understanding how foreign policy affects communities at all levels, from across gender, racial, ethnic lines, and how power influences people's experiences. So that's kind of, on the piece of kind of thinking about the framework, which again, I'll turn to Gayatri to kind of give the coalition's recommendations there. But on the implementation side here, I'd say that there is a framework there of really pushing for a mix of ensuring that it's policies and programs that again kind of touch across diplomacy, development, defense, and trade, having the resources to truly match the vision, and to truly be able to draw on the contributions and respond to the needs of half the world's population, of having research that helps to inform this work. So of truly having monitoring, evaluation, accountability, to really make sure that we're following through with the rhetoric and commitments that governments have made. Gayatri, you want to jump in on all the work you guys are doing?
Sure. I thought we were going to go to Belquis next, but I'm happy to jump in. I would just say, echoing exactly what Jamila was saying about the structures. We're at a really exciting time in U.S. history, U.S. foreign policy making, to really think through how can our foreign policy really advance peace, security, social justice, human rights. And there are several considerations that the feminist foreign policy for the U.S. community has kind of thought of, like, in terms of how are we choosing to leverage our foreign assistance dollars and diplomacy towards lifting 734 million people out of poverty or 70 million people out of humanitarian crises? How are we structuring our policies so that the military, state of the art as it is used only as a last resort, and that we're prioritizing development, diplomacy, international cooperation, and peaceful resolution of conflict? And how are we centering human rights, gender equality, inclusion, equity, diversity into our work? So when we think about feminist foreign policy, there are several kind of principles that bubble to mind. When it comes to foreign policy, a feminist framework really says we ought to be centering it on human rights and human dignity. So enshrining respect for human rights into all of our work, foreign and domestic. And this must mean recognizing women's rights to bodily autonomy, living free from violence, having the ability and the access to lead and participate in public life on equal footing, and equal access to resources and opportunities. Feminist foreign policy also really looks at being inclusive, representative, and intersectional. And it's not a passive obligation. It's really an incentive to take proactive action, to amplify the voices of those who are often unheard in their communities, to really invest in underserved and underrepresented communities, and to really look at and address the multiple intersecting ways that people are experiencing discrimination. Making sure that foreign policy is responsive to the needs on the ground, so ensuring leadership and decision-making is inclusive and is based on data and the gender analysis component that Jamille was referencing. And finally, recognizing that foreign policy is no longer just kind of a state-to-state process. It involves a whole host of actors. It involves civil society. It involves people who are impacted by the foreign policy programs and initiatives. So really taking that inclusive approach and making sure that we're being held accountable in the work that we're doing. So in terms of the US and some of the recommendations that we're making for the US structures, it's a really exciting time. I mean, yesterday we saw these great announcements around the White House Gender Policy Council. And that really aligns with a lot of the recommendations that we've been making for a central body within the US government that's high level, supported by senior leadership, and particularly the president and vice president, that will kind of take up this mantle and make sure that we're looking across the government at all of our programs, all of our policies, all of our initiatives to build in equity and gender equality and diversity into our work. We also recommend making sure that diversity, equity, and inclusion is reflected not just in the political appointments at high levels, but all the way downstream. We're looking at hiring practices and retention practices and how we're really building a US government workforce that is representative, but also being held accountable to promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion within their own work externally and on their own teams. And then finally, accountability, making sure that we are being transparent, that we're being inclusive, that civil society and impacted populations are consulted, and it's not just a top-down approach, but really a co-creation process. And then finally, how are we leveraging our resources wisely? And this is one of the more specific recommendations that our coalition has been making, that 100% of foreign assistance programming understand gender and how that program or that policy or that initiative impacts gender issues. But that 20% of foreign assistance programming be focused on gender equality and advancing equity and inclusion. And so it seems radical, but it's really not. It's really just ensuring that we are not doing harm in the work that we're doing through our foreign policy, that we're taking the steps and the actions needed to analyze and make our foreign policy programs and initiatives as smart and as effective and sustainable as possible by looking at how they impact different populations differently. And so those are kind of the big pictures. We have specific recommendations per foreign policy agency or actors like the trade representative, but it's really just about these structures and these big picture kind of principles and ideas that need to be built into the ethos of the U.S. foreign assistance apparatus, and then cascaded throughout all of our foreign policy agencies.
Asmik,
Thank you so much. And
can I go next? Well, thank you so much. I am so glad that Gayatri mentioned the do no harm concept, which is oftentimes forgotten or neglected by policymakers. If I may, Asmik, slightly take a different approach and take a step back and take a look at the broader picture, basically, as to the need for policies that serve the needs of women and girls everywhere. And please do stop me if I go over my time. I think this month, Women's History Month, is important for all of us to recognize that we have come a long way, especially in the past several decades. And that is thanks to the women leaders before us whose courage, commitment, and determination and sacrifices paved the way for us to have better lives than those before us. It was because of those before us that today there are numerous domestic, regional, and international measures that are put in place to address basically the systematic discrimination, abuse, and exclusion of women from decision making. And also, while remarkable progress has been made because of these tools and instruments, a lot needs to be done. And I hope we get into the more details of the needs and concerns of women everywhere. We in the West still have challenges, while they may differ in the degree and the level from those living in the less privileged societies. But before we go also into the whole question of feminist foreign policy, I think it's important to note that when we talk about the differences between the Western and Eastern notions of feminism, basically it means that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities, but there are still even women around the world who want to take a distance from being labeled or called feminists. So there is this misunderstanding and misconception of what feminism means. So our work individually and collectively requires us to talk about the issues that will come under the umbrella of feminist agenda and for ways to influence policies that will have to be put in place in order to address those gaps and challenges. So I would like to leave it here and then come back to the question later.
Thank you so much, Belquis. So we are going to transition to dig a little bit deeper into the work that each one of you does. And I would like to start with Gayatri, if I may, because you mentioned something that I want to follow up on. You mentioned the work of the coalition, and you mentioned this phrase that just jumped at me, the co-creation process. And I want to follow up on that phrase and to ask you about the framework that was proposed in 2020, and what are the, can you please dive a little bit deeper on the challenges that you see when it comes to implementing the recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, it was certainly one of those instances where the process was almost as important as the outcome. And so how it started was kind of some stock taking, some consultations around the world that included, I think, over 300 partners from every region of the world to think through what are their key priorities or their key ideas or their key interests for a U.S. feminist foreign policy. And then taking some of those ideas and kind of the bare bones of a set of recommendations, a group of us got together, spanning across a number of different sectors. There were, well, not sectors necessarily, but a number of different roles. There were organizations like Jamile's at CFR that are think tanks and really like policy leaders on the thinking behind U.S. foreign policy. There were organizations like mine that really focus on implementation and how can U.S. foreign policy support eradicating poverty and alleviating humanitarian suffering. There were other organizations that do research. There are other organizations that focus on peace and security, while there are partners who focus on climate change, on reproductive rights and women's health, et cetera. So it was a broad group of people who got together to really think through, okay, taking these principles and these ideas in mind from, you know, a broad range of actors that we've consulted with, what does that mean for U.S. structures, for the U.S. context? What is it that we need to specifically recommend to the U.S. government? And that's where we came up with this framework of, you know, focusing on the structures, focusing on leadership and identifying who will be driving this process and how that will impact the agencies that are currently implementing foreign policy work. What are the principles that should undergird all of this work? And then from that, we launched the paper, the framework that you're referencing. And since then, it's been another process of coalition building, really thinking through who are the various actors within the U.S. advocacy space who have a point of view or have a stake in this game, and really building that group. And I'm proud to say, I don't have the final number, I should have that off the top of my head, but we have about 87 organizations who support the framework and really want to see it advance. And through that, we have the doers and we have the thinkers and we have those who are really strongly supportive, all of whom have come together and really thought through how can we influence this particular administration. And so we put together a transition memo over the summer to offer to the Biden-Harris campaign. And since the election, we've been working very closely to influence what the White House Gender Policy Council will look like, how it'll be staffed, what its focus will be, what it will look like and how it will interact with the State Department and USAID and the Department of Defense, et cetera. So it's an ongoing iterative process, but it's very much built on this idea of breaking down these kind of intransigent power dynamics that have really kept this kind of colonial look at feminism and foreign assistance, and thinking through how can we make this a more inclusive process. And so through that, we have co-created to this stage, but continue to be committed to co-creating. This is not something that is one and done. It has to continue to be built upon. And that is something that we will continue to be doing with our partners.
Thank you so much, Gayatri. You know, the mentioning of the U.S. government and the current administration is a perfect segue for me to ask a question to Jamille. You have such a broad experience when it comes to feminist foreign policy. You have worked at the UN, you have worked at the U.S. government, and now civil society organization. What do you think is the best approach to the women, peace, and security agenda in the U.S. government right now?
Sure. So I do think that the executive order we saw yesterday, kind of establishing the global policy, the Gender Policy Council, is incredibly promising. It calls for a whole of government strategy, including with budgets and resources to advance gender equality, both in the US and globally. So thinking too about the frame of our conversation with you all together of linking feminist foreign policy to domestic policy. This is kind of how the Biden administration has framed its approach to gender equality, of having kind of the policy council both have responsibilities for domestic gender equality and global gender equality, and for the whole of government strategy to cover both, and to really kind of recognize that there is a connection, there's a relationship between what is happening around gender equity here in the United States and what's happening around gender equity globally. And both of those together influence our national security and our economic prosperity, both that of the United States and globally. So I think that's a really important starting point. On the women, peace, and security side specifically, we're lucky that there's already a law in place that has laid out a strong framework. So the US's first NAP, National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, was 10 years ago. So we have, and then the law passed, and there's been implementation plans. We have a lot of work that's gone on in government over the last 10 years. I think the real opportunity right now, there's a few on the Women, Peace, and Security side that I think can build on the momentum of the Gender Policy Council, and with that, the White House support and leadership. One is to actually tie the Women, Peace, and Security vision, the idea that half the population's contributions actually improve security, make our national security efforts more effective. That idea has not yet been fully absorbed by the broader national security community. So there are too many national security questions, policies, programs that proceed without attention to either how they impact half the population, back to we shouldn't be causing harm, or to the question of how can women and girls be partners and allies? How does their perspective inform our national security strategies and programs to make them more effective? And it's something, we've used this argument in the counterterrorism space, that we see terrorists recognizing that women can be effective and explicitly recruiting and radicalizing them to advance their aims. But on the counterterrorism side and on the broader national security side, we don't see women typically as partners and as effective leaders so it's a real untapped opportunity, a real untapped potential there to improve our own national security efforts, to actually kind of engage women as partners, invest in their work. There's a very small percentage. I know there was one OECD study from a few years ago that found 0.4% of all aid to fragile contexts went to women leaders, women-led organizations. So we really aren't kind of investing in and lifting up the work that women are doing on the front lines. So all of that to say that I think there's a real opportunity right now with the vision that was laid out in yesterday's executive order and framing kind of how the Biden-Harris administration wants to advance gender equality globally, to really now to really look across all of our national security work and make sure that we are applying a gender lens analysis to it and drawing on half the population to make our national security work more effective.
Thank you so much, Jamila. You mentioned gender and violent extremism and counterterrorism, and I want to follow up on that, but I want to ask this question to Belquis. In 2016, Belquis, you co-authored a report on Afghan women and violent extremism that criticized the construct of women as disempowered victims. Could you please tell us more about the harms of this construct in the context of feminist foreign policy?
Sure, thank you. My screen doesn't show, so my apologies. Am I unmute right now?
Yes.
Oh, okay, cool. Thank you. So it was in 2016 when my co-author Sadaf Lakhani and I were having tea together, and then we talked about the exclusion of women from counter-terrorism decisions and discussions. And then we came up with this idea of conducting research in Afghanistan to look at women's multiple roles. I mean, to us, it was clear that women play multiple roles in security, in terrorism, and in counterterrorism. So we wanted to make sure that others also understand. It was a little controversial at the time because, as you know, for many, many years, women have been perceived as naturally peace builders and that they are inherently peaceful and they avoid violence and so on. So the research that we conducted in Afghanistan looked at women's participation in the during the Soviet era as well as in the past 20 years. What we found was, as I said in the beginning, that women have played multiple roles that includes being mobilizers, sympathizers, logistic providers, informants, and also, most importantly, preventers of violence in Afghanistan at community level. And we also found that some had played direct combat roles. In terms of one other thing that when I interviewed former commanders, Mujahideen commanders and so on, and asked about women's role in the so-called jihad against the Soviets at the time, they told me that this one commander at least said that, oh, women bring their sons to us all the time, and they want us to teach them how to fight and how to defeat invaders. And oftentimes when one son dies, the mother brings other sons to be included, trained, and included in the fight against Soviets. What we found interesting was that although in the eyes of the Taliban, the current fight is also a jihad against invaders, but women had a completely different views on that, and they did not play as an active role as they played in the war against the Soviets. And because of this stereotypes that usually women are seen, perceived as peaceful and lesser of a threat to security. And just as Jamila said, terrorist groups and violent extremist groups take advantage of the fact that policymakers don't view women as dangerous as men do. So they tap onto that potential by recruiting them and also having them recruit others online or in person. Oftentimes security measures are lax when it involves women. And honestly, many countries don't even have plans and strategies in place that involves addressing issues in which women are the threat to security, as well as ways to utilize their potential and contribution in countering violent extremism and terrorism. So the short answer to your question is that unfortunately, violent extremist groups have been way ahead of us in using women in a very negative way for destructive purposes. Women have a lot more potential than what is being recognized today. If they are given an opportunity and platform to do what they're best at, and that is to contribute for the betterment of the society and the future generation, things will be amazing. But today, as we see, even in the most progressive and developed countries, women voices are often unheard or excluded, in developing policies to counter terrorism and violent extremism. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Belquis. Oh, I'm sorry.
Could I just add to that? I mean, I think I couldn't agree more with Jamille and Belquis about the need to really reframe how we're looking at women and their contributions. I think there's been way too much tendency to frame them as victims. But you know what we're seeing from CARE in the development in the humanitarian space is that we're so much more effective, so much more inclusive when we're thinking of women as frontline responders, as people with their own capabilities and capacities to define solutions, define the issues. And so often their voices are excluded. And so really thinking through what are the systemic changes we need to make to address that piece first, or maybe not first, but like prominently. How do we make sure that women are part of decision making? How do we make sure that they're part of leadership at all levels, and from political leadership all the way into their households, and really so that they have a voice? And I think the U.S. foreign assistance and foreign policy really has a role to play in terms of how we're supporting, local movements and women's rights organizations and women-led operations that are really trying to demand that change. So I really strongly wanted to kind of echo and support what Belquis was saying just now.
Thank you so much for that, Gayatri and Belquis. Again, very, very fascinating discussion. And that kind of leads a little bit into our next phase of questions. We talked a little bit about, Jamille talked about this, Belquis talked about this, about how we are there are different understandings about what feminist foreign policy is and how to use that to build coalitions. So you talked about that a little bit earlier. So I'm going to dive into a little bit of more targeted questions. So Gayatri, we're going to go back to you actually. You've been working in the advocacy space for a long time now at CARE, and we're really interested in how you've been able to tackle those issues from an advocacy angle and talk about the unique role that advocacy plays in pushing forward the feminist foreign policy agenda, and how specifically you go about strategizing the right approach to that. So we would love to hear more about that.
Sure. I mean, I think advocacy at its heart is an opportunity to collectively communicate across a number of different realms, and that's part of the process, I would say, or maybe the basis of an effective advocacy strategy is bringing together the right people to, and again, going to use the word co-create the work. And so with something like feminist foreign policy, it's huge. It cuts across so many different spaces and levers and capacities and issues, that it's, it can be challenging to bring together such a broad base of interested parties to collectively and agree on something to put forward. So I think, putting a lot of emphasis into getting that process right, but also accepting responsibility when we get it wrong. I mean, we went through a number of different stakeholder consultations that were focused on, for instance, feminist humanitarian policy, feminism and feminist foreign policy and trade, feminist foreign policy and development. And not everyone's going to agree, but really trying to just get to the basics of what we as a community want to put our thoughts and our energy behind as a community more broadly. And so I would say, being very thoughtful and deliberative about the process of formulating what you're going to advocate on, and then being very thoughtful and deliberative about recognizing who you might be inadvertently leaving out and doing a better job of bringing them in if and when you can. I think more specifically for U.S. feminist foreign policy, our process has really been about, once we got those ideas on paper and built a pretty strong base of support, making it easy or at least clear for policymakers to see how that could translate into U.S. Structure. So, you know, we proposed a White House Feminist Foreign Policy Council, or Feminist Policy Council. We ended up with a White House Gender Policy Council. But you know, having that idea out there that you need some high-level structure that will drive this work was the point. And so, you know, making those kinds of big picture actions really accessible, and providing the support to kind of think through what those look like and what you would need to get there, I think is a really distinct role that the advocacy community can play. And it's, you know, I think that the current administration had a lot to deal with from the very beginning from day one. And then they've made some really strong progress on our issues. And I think that's largely because there was such strong collective solidarity through the advocacy community for a lot of the changes that they made when they took office.
Thank you for that. That's really, really helpful. I'm thinking a lot about, you said about accepting the responsibility when you get it wrong, and what does that mean in how we move forward. And so I'm hearing you talk about, you know, the White House councils and things like that, and kind of like the coalition of the advocacy community is really inspiring to hear, because we want to push forward and think about like what we have done wrong and who we have left out, as you said, and how to kind of push the agenda forward. So thank you for that. Belquis, I'm going to turn to you because I have it written down here. You worked on the USAID-funded Regional Afghan Municipalities Program for Urban Populations Regional Committees, long name, or ramp up. So I'm going to turn to you because I'm interested in how can feminist foreign policy be localized, even though it's supposed to be more of an interstate relational sort of framework.
Sure, thank you. Before answering your specific question, I was just wondering if I could also add my 2 cents on what Gayatri just said about consistency and advocacy. I think influencing and informing policy is such a huge responsibility that women leaders, particularly when it comes to improving women's situation and women's groups, have. It requires consistency, collective efforts, and persistence, and building coalitions. It's also important to document, just as Gayatri said, our failures. When it comes to foreign aid and foreign policy, we talk a lot about this jargon of lessons learning. But the reality is, how much can we learn? Because we keep repeating the same mistakes over and over. We go from one country to another country and take the mistakes that we have made in one country, we take it to another country. So I think lessons learned is important, but also how to operationalize and make use of those lessons in order to avoid making the same mistakes is also very important. So these days, I spend a lot of my time and also a lot of my sleep on working on Afghan women's participation in the peace process and about their frustrations with the international community, as well as their own politicians and leaders. Which I hope to get a chance to talk about that at some point. But back to my work with Ramp Up East, which was a governance project in Afghanistan implemented in 13 provinces. I worked on that project as a deputy chief of party. Let me tell you that working on gender mainstreaming and gender equity equality issues in a place like Afghanistan is very challenging. One faces pushbacks and challenges, not only from Afghans who have lived and grew up in a patriarchal society, but also from non-Afghans who go there to work and help people. If I can just bring you one example, the project was tasked to build a small-scale infrastructure in different provinces, which sometimes included building bridges and roads and all that, but also public latrines, something that people don't talk about that much. I was reading proposals from one of our provinces, and I noticed that we were building public latrines, and I was so happy, and I said, wow, that's great because it's needed. And then when I looked at the details, I noticed that the location of those public latrines were chosen near the mosque and near a market where they sold auto parts and stuff. And I said, well, how are women going to go and use those public latrines? So I called the managers, including an expatriate, and I said, well, can you explain to me in this drawing where the women-specific latrines will be located? And they looked at me as if I had spoken an alien language. And I said, what do you mean, latrine for women? And one of our Afghan male colleagues, very traditional, he said, well, you don't understand. In that particular site, there are no educated women. I was like, what do you mean? Do you mean that only educated women need to use latrines or bathrooms? And I was surprised to see that how one of our expatriate, an American colleague, came to his defense and said, well, we have to be culturally sensitive. We can't just impose our Western ideas. So that I found really frustrating. And then many other examples of such. But specifically to your question, I think making funding conditional to promoting and protecting women's rights and gender mainstreaming are some of the initial measures that can impact governance, which is based on gender equity and equality. And also putting in place measures and indicators, which oftentimes is neglected to ensure that government's institutions' performance is monitored by independent and civil society actors to improve accountability. It's also vitally important to include women in decision-making at all levels and every single sector that we as US-based organizations or Americans put our money to. And those steps and measures should not be downgraded and sacrificed in the name of being culturally sensitive. Even on the issues of cultural sensitivity, I think it's very important that we also give an opportunity to women so they can also explain their interpretation of understanding of what cultural sensitivity means on those contexts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Belquis, and really great anecdote. It's really interesting how we kind of think about cultural sensitivity versus gender needs and how they sort of interact or intersect and how people kind of view them differently. So thank you so much for that anecdote. On that end around women being present in every part of the strategy and the policies and the practices, I'm going to turn to Jamille around the idea of the USAID administrator. And I was just curious if you found that the change from USAID administrator to being on the National Security Council will change how you think about how the WPS agenda will be used or operationalized?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it is clearly important that the USAID administrator is on the NSC to ensure that the perspective of global development, sustainable development, all of the work that USAID does around conflict prevention, fragility, humanitarian assistance, that all of that is represented in the policy process and helps to inform the decisions that the US government makes within its foreign policy. So that's certainly a very welcome and promising step. Certainly, the nominated administrator, Samantha Power, has a long history of support and attention to human rights broadly, including attention to women's and girls' rights and opportunities. So, if confirmed, she would certainly be a very strong ally and an important leader across USAID to really kind of help advance the agency's own work of making sure that kind of the work around gender isn't siloed from kind of the broader agency work as well. There's certainly, we see that challenge across all of the US government, that investments in women and girls' rights and opportunities tend to be kind of a separate program and not really kind of integrated or really leveraging kind of the full budget, full US foreign assistance of that USAID manages, including as well as, what we see at the State Department and MCC across other agencies too, of really kind of fully leveraging and investing in half the population as allies, as important partners, as kind of leaders on the front lines of advancing kind of peace and security in their own communities and countries.
Thank you so much for that, Jamille. I agree. I am a Samantha Power fan. So I am very hopeful for her confirmation. And so I'm now going to pass this back over to Asmik for the next group of questions.
So the next group of questions, I want to start with a question to Belquis, but I also want to invite all of you to comment like you've been doing it. Belquis, I want to go back to your work as a leading voice for Afghan women, and I'm trying to. Give me 1 second. My screen is malfunctioning. And I wanted to go back to your work as a leading voice for experiences and agency of Afghan women. And I wanted to ask your thoughts about feminist foreign policy as it relates to the peace talks that are currently going on. And, what are the successes that you have seen and in the process, and what are the challenges that you have seen and you're anticipating, as much as you can tell us.
Great, thank you. Well, if I can just go back to what Jamille said a few minutes ago regarding our women, peace and security law and so on. Unfortunately, to date, our government, in its engagement with the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan, has not fully abided by the principles outlined in the women, peace and security law, let alone a feminist foreign policy. Our women, peace and security strategy approach mandates the US government departments, including the Department of State and Defense, to address security-related barriers to the protection of women. This week and last week, Afghanistan lost 4 of its female journalists and a medical doctor. This is a continuation of targeted attempt by Taliban and other violent extremist groups such as ISIS in silencing Afghan women. Unfortunately, we and other international actors and states who have committed to the implementation of the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 that calls for the protection of women, as well as for their meaningful and effective engagement and participation in all peace and security related processes. While it's a welcome development that there are 4 very courageous women in the Afghan negotiation team, included by the Afghan government, it did not come that easy. Afghan women have been advocating for women's meaningful participation in the peace process for many, many years, even before we in the US started talking about a peace process in Afghanistan. Women have been holding consultation throughout the country. They have launched so many campaigns by media, social media, and otherwise, calling for the necessity for a ceasefire in the country, as well as the protection of the gains of the past 20 so years. Fortunately, while there has been a lot of statements and condemnation and all that by world leaders, in reality, their voices have been discarded by leaders in the international community. And oftentimes, Afghan women are seen as impediments to the peace process and the stability of the country. And that's because Afghan women demand for things that may be perceived as challenging the power and authority of power brokers. So to that end, what was I going to say? Afghan women have not received the type of support that they deserve from the US government and policymakers. Remember 20 years ago, at least in statements, if not in reality, when we went to Afghanistan, we used the protection of Afghan women as somehow as an excuse to go there. Now that they need us the most, we are unfortunately not doing enough to support their participation and their protection. They have, over the past 40 years, paid a very heavy price for during the war, and now they're doing the same for peace. It's also very discouraging that some in the international community, including some here in the US, expect Afghan women to compromise and be willing to give up some of their rights for peace in Afghanistan. I want to go back to what Sanam this morning said about what peace means for power brokers and policymakers may not mean the same thing to civilians, and especially girls and women. So the efforts of Afghan women, the call for having an opportunity to meet with Taliban face to face and show them that Afghan women of today are not the same who are oppressed, terrorized, publicly humiliated by Taliban when they were in power. Today, when Taliban were in power between 1996 and 2001, you may recall or have read that girls were banned from going to school, women's employment were completely banned except for medical personnel. They were reduced to beggars on the street. I will never forget, after the fall of the Taliban, when I went to Kabul, I was conducting research on women's rights situation at the time, and I met with a female judge who I asked her how it felt when she first went back to work after 4 or 5 years. And she looked at me in the eye, and then she had tears in her eyes, and she said, "It's really embarrassing, but I had forgotten my signature because I never had to use it for 5 years." So that was very hard for me. And of all the stories that I heard during that visit in Kabul, that really broke my heart. I also heard from my teachers and my university lecturers that in order for them to support their families, they had to either work in bakeries, women-run bakeries, or they had to do embroidery and tailoring. So when Afghan women want for meaningful participation and inclusion, they have something to reference to. That's why they're including that their participation and their inclusion is important, because others cannot continue choosing and deciding their fate. I'm hopeful, but I'm also carefully optimistic, because the way things are going right now, there is a lot more chance of going into a civil war than to a stability that's hoped for. Thank you, Asmik.
Thank you, Belquis. That was a very touching story. Thank you for sharing with us. Gayatri, Jamila, would you like to add anything to the women's participation in peace talks?
One thing I'd love to share, I know part of the frame for us all as well was kind of looking at research opportunities for the community. So I did want to share one site that we have at CFR. We have an interactive on women's participation in peace processes, where we're tracking the numbers of women at peace tables, recognizing this is by no means the full story of women's influence and participation, but it's a starting point of being able to reflect on, in fact, just how few processes, peace negotiations proceed with representation of women as negotiators, mediators, or as signatories. So that's, one area of just being able to kind of point to the quantitative side of what those numbers look like, and then kind of complementing it with the real stories of what that actually means. How are women influencing the process, either through formal seats or informally through civil society, what their role is to influence the peace and security efforts on the front lines in their communities, negotiating detainee release, helping reintegrate former fighters, working on conflict prevention and mediation within their communities, as well as kind of once an agreement is signed, what actually happens next, how women are involved in ensuring it's implemented, ensuring they then get leadership roles in government. So we found, for example, that between 1992 and 2019, women on average were only 13% of negotiators, 6% of mediators, and 6% of signatories. So just as a check on us all, these are clearly too low. If you have half the population only represented as 6% of signatories of peace processes, and clearly their voices are missing. And that's kind of a piece to try to help ensure kind of globally as we look today at Libya and Yemen and what will come in Myanmar. Let's hope, as we look at kind of responses to the coup, these are all questions of how do we kind of look at what women's roles are within that. And we are also seeing kind of women on the front lines of nonviolent movements, nonviolent peace movements and transition movements around the world. from Myanmar right now to Belarus, looking, more recently, Lebanon, Sudan. In Sudan, there's estimates that women at times were 70% of the protesters on the streets, and then there was express decisions by the military to use sexual violence against protesters to try to intimidate women off the streets to weaken the movement. When the movement was successful, women needed to continue to advocate for their leadership, and we saw them not represented well in the initial kind of transition commissions, and kind of now continuing to try to build on their leadership in the movement itself as iconic image of that protest, build that into kind of their role in decision making right now.
I can't add anything that hasn't already been said on Afghanistan particularly, but I do want to say that there are so many parallels when it comes to humanitarian response as well, when in terms of exclusion of women from leadership and participation. And it's COVID is a good example. It's a global pandemic that has affected every single community around the world in some way or the other. And a study that we did, that CARE did, I think June of last year, really demonstrated just how strongly excluded women were from leadership structures. So for the countries that we surveyed, 75% of them didn't even have a fourth of their leadership structure in terms of response to COVID comprised of women. And that includes countries like the United States, where at the time of that report, there was only one woman on the COVID task force, and she was added much later than she should have been. And so just thinking through, how much impact a humanitarian crisis has on women and girls, and yet they're not part of the decision-making or the leadership or the thinking around the solutions and the resources that they need to recover or to survive, is preposterous. I mean, women and girls are incredibly impacted by these crises, and yet to exclude their voices, to exclude their needs, does such a disservice, as well as it's just ineffective. And so we really need to think through how we're centralizing, bringing women's voices and leadership and ideas and capacity into how we implement our foreign policy around the world, and what we are doing as the United States to really build that in through our diplomacy, through our defense policies, through our humanitarian engagement, et cetera. It's a critically important point.
Can I just say something on that? I think while we are all focused on the ongoing and immediate impact of COVID on everyone, but especially on women, we should, now is the time to plan for long-term programs to address the long-term impact and implications of COVID on women and also other vulnerable groups. COVID has not only impacted people's health, but COVID has impacted people's financial situations, economy, and has caused in some places migrations as well, especially places where there aren't enough health facilities. People had to become internally displaced in order to get the type of support that they deserve to have. So in our foreign policy here in the US, I think we must mandate gender analysis in everything we do moving forward. I say gender analysis because in most of our reporting, especially the ones to the Congress, are more interested in number and quantity. I think we have to think beyond quantity and think about long-term planning in order to avoid and prevent further crises related to COVID, yeah, especially in countries where they need our support. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for that wonderful discussion. So we have a little bit over than 10 minutes left. So I'm going to move to a closing question, and then I'll give the floor back over to Asmik for some closing remarks. But I do want to get your last thoughts on this question, maybe just like 2 minutes for each of you, to discuss how students in the consortium can turn some of the discussion topics that we've had today into policy research and actionable change to assist with the work that you all do. So maybe just a quick points from each of you. We can start with Jamille.
Great. Well, I'd love to share a research paper, and I know you guys will share it with folks, that we just published yesterday that looks at actually transforming international affairs education to address diversity, equity, and inclusion. I co-authored it with Carla Capel from Georgetown and Ruben Brigady from the University of the South. And I think it's an opportunity where communities supporting feminist foreign policy, racial equity, LGBTQ+ rights, attention to the rights and experiences of other marginalized groups, kind of it's a broad frame of really looking to prompt the international affairs schools to recognize the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion to security, sustainable development, foreign policy, economic growth, kind of across the spectrum of global issues. Really recognizing the importance of them and integrating them into the work of schools. So we lay out an agenda in the report of how international affairs schools, as they shape the next generation of national security leaders, kind of what steps they need to take to address the fact that currently there is an insufficient leadership, there's outdated curricula, there's alienating school climates that leave future foreign policy experts ill-prepared to kind of address this range of social forces kind of shaping the world right now. We have seen some progress. So I would say, it's exciting to see, dozens of deans, voice support from Harvard to Princeton to Columbia to beyond. We've seen a new diversity and inclusion standard in the accreditation process. We've seen some schools kind of take on new certificate programs. Certainly GW and other schools in this consortium, Georgetown, have different, attention to gender and different certificate programs available. But there's a real need, I think, kind of across academia, to really kind of make sure that class syllabi actually kind of consider how diversity, equity, and inclusion influence global affairs, that there's greater diversity in the student population, PhD students, teachers, professors, administration, kind of across the pipeline, to really kind of, again, really think about how the educational system is key to kind of changing the face and shape of US foreign policy. So would definitely point you all to that and any opportunities you all see kind of for advocacy with your own administrations, to build on this and really make sure that your schools are addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion broadly.
Thank you. I'll turn to Gayatri next, and then we can end with Belquis.
Sure. I have so many ideas, but I think one thing that Jamille just said really is the core of it. We need to understand the impact of a lack of response or a lack of gender lens thinking or feminist lens thinking and conversely, we need to study the impact of what progress or what gaps we have when we do institute a feminist framework or a feminist lens to our foreign policy. And so I think as advocates, we're always asked, by policymakers, well, what's your basis? What's your evidence? And I kind of love that question, because that is what policy should be based on. It should be based on evidence and data, but we don't always have the evidence or the data or the hard talking points that say why it's so critically important to the bottom line that we promote gender equality, or that we have diversity, equity, and inclusion built into our national structures. So really thinking through how we can make that argument through research and data is always helpful. And it's always a moving target, but it's incredibly important to stay consistent that our policy should be based on real evidence. One plug for just our grassroots network. CARE has a grassroots constituent network that advocates directly with members of Congress and the administration on a number of these issues, on humanitarian assistance, on the foreign policy budget, on reproductive rights, gender-based violence, many of these issues that students and the general public are really curious and interested in. So if you are interested in not necessarily just doing research, but using your voice as a constituent to influence your policymaker, your member of Congress, please feel free to reach out and think through that as a potential way of staying active on these issues.
Jamille and Gayatri has said everything that I wanted to say, but my very short advice to the students would be to first and foremost understand the power of your voice and advocacy, and you can make a difference. Be proactive in seeking ideas from grassroots particularly, and adopt a participatory action research approach, meaning that when you do want to conduct research, try to engage with grassroots and have them help you identify the gaps and needs for further research, and then link it to policy and policy decisions. And last thing, make your research products and papers available in local languages. Oftentimes, when we conduct research, we only consider the English-speaking or Western language-speaking audience. I think it's important that you share your wealth of knowledge and the product of your work also with people who don't speak the 5 or 6 internationally recognized languages. That's very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think these recommendations are so helpful for us as students who are going to be transitioning from theory to practice within the next year or so. And we have just a few minutes left, and I want to go into a closing of this section. And on behalf of the DC Student Consortium, I want to thank all of our panelists for taking this time out of their busy days to be here with us today. And I'm sure many participants share my sentiment of wonder and gratitude and curiosity that will propel all of us to look into and learn more about feminist foreign policy, as well as your individual and collective work going forward. And dear participants, I also want to thank you for joining us today. I know there were a few questions in the Q&A that came through, and we didn't have, we are running out of time to address them, but I want to assure that those questions are very important to us. And today's conversation with our panelists, as well as your questions, will be instrumental for research and policy areas for the Student Consortium to focus on in the near future. And if you look in the chat section, you will see in the chat box, you will see where and how to follow the work of our panelists today, as well as how to engage with the Student Consortium on Women, Peace and Security. You will see our social media accounts. You can follow us and to stay informed on future publications or events that will come up. And with that, I would like to close this session and wish you to stay safe, stay healthy, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.
It's all great. Good luck.
Thank you.